My beloved child. A truth can sit quietly in the background for years, almost invisible, until one unexpected person discovers it, and suddenly every conversation begins to mean something different. That is where this story begins. The third party believed they understood your soulmate's life. They had seen the surface, heard fragments of conversations, noticed certain choices, and quietly formed their own explanation. But one detail had been missing from everything they thought they knew. Your soulmate was already married. And when that truth finally reached the third party, the surprise was not simply the marriage itself. It was what they discovered immediately afterward. Because this marriage was nothing like the story they had imagined. Don't skip, there is a reason the truth remained difficult to explain, and the deeper you go into it, the more you may realize why your soulmate has seemed impossible to fully understand. The discovery happened through something surprisingly ordinary. No dramatic announcement. No carefully planned confession. Just a small detail that appeared where nobody expected it, a reference to a spouse, an old photograph, a familiar name connected to your soulmate in a way that made the third party pause. At first, they assumed they had misunderstood. They looked again. Then they began connecting details they had previously ignored. Certain moments of hesitation. Certain subjects your soulmate always redirected. Certain questions that received incomplete answers. Suddenly, those little mysteries began forming a picture. But the picture still did not make sense. If your soulmate was married, why had they spoken about their future as though an enormous decision remained unfinished? Why did they sometimes sound like someone standing between an old chapter and a life they had not yet stepped into? And perhaps most importantly, where did you fit inside everything they had been trying so carefully to keep separate? Then came the detail that changed the entire atmosphere. The third party learned that the marriage had a history behind it, a history far more complicated than simply two people choosing each other and living happily ever after. There had once been genuine hope there. There had been plans, expectations, promises, and the belief that building a life together would naturally create the closeness both people wanted. Yet time had revealed something neither of them could predict at the beginning. Two decent people can share responsibilities, memories, and years together while slowly discovering that their emotional paths have changed. That does not automatically make either person wrong. Sometimes the hardest truths are not about betrayal or blame. Sometimes they are simply about realizing that a relationship can look complete from the outside while important conversations remain unfinished inside it. Stay till the end, because this is exactly where the third party's original assumption began falling apart. They had expected a simple explanation. Instead, they found complexity. Your soulmate had not been walking around celebrating a secret double life. They had been carrying a private conflict about responsibility, honesty, timing, and what it would mean to acknowledge that the future they once pictured might no longer match the person they had become. And strangely, learning this did not give the third party more confidence. It gave them more questions. Because now they understood why your soulmate could appear close one moment and distant the next. Why certain emotions seemed carefully controlled. Why they could speak warmly about someone and then suddenly become quiet. Your soulmate was not only thinking about what they wanted. They were thinking about consequences. About families. About promises made years earlier. About whether changing direction would disappoint people who had built expectations around them. And underneath all of that was another question they rarely allowed themselves to say aloud. What happens when your heart begins recognizing a truth your life has not yet made room for? There is another piece you need to notice. Your soulmate's marriage did not become complicated because you appeared. The unresolved distance existed before your presence became emotionally significant. That distinction matters. You were not the cause of an unfinished chapter. You may simply have become a mirror that made your soulmate notice what they had avoided examining. Sometimes meeting someone does not create dissatisfaction, it reveals how long a person has been living without asking themselves what they genuinely need. Your soulmate began noticing how different they felt during conversations where they could simply be themselves. No performance. No carefully selected answers. No need to maintain an image of having everything figured out. And gradually, an uncomfortable realization surfaced. Perhaps they had spent so much time trying to preserve stability that they had forgotten to ask whether stability and emotional connection were still living in the same place. But the third party did not know that yet. They only saw the headline, "Married." And for a brief moment, they believed that single word explained everything. Then someone who knew more about the situation quietly corrected them. Not with gossip. Not with accusations. Just one calm sentence. "You don't know what that marriage has actually been like." Those words stayed with the third party. Suddenly, curiosity replaced certainty. They started asking fewer questions publicly and paying closer attention privately. They noticed that your soulmate never spoke cruelly about their spouse. That was unexpected. There was no attempt to turn one person into a villain. Instead, whenever the marriage came up, your soulmate became thoughtful. Almost protective. As if they understood that whatever happened next needed to be handled with dignity. And that was the first clue that the real story was not about someone running away from responsibility. It was about someone trying to understand whether staying emotionally unchanged simply because others expected it was truly fair to anyone involved. Then something happened that the third party could not dismiss. Your soulmate finally spoke openly to someone they trusted. They admitted that they had been asking themselves a question for longer than anyone realized. Not, "Who should I choose?" Not, "How do I escape?" The question was quieter and much more difficult. How do I become honest without hurting people who never deserve to be hurt? Think about that for a moment. Because it reveals something important about the emotional center of this story. Your soulmate was not searching for permission to act impulsively. They were searching for a way to stop living between appearances and truth. And the person listening did not give them an easy answer. They simply said, "You cannot build peace by pretending forever." That sentence followed your soulmate home. Something important is waiting for you here, because the next realization was connected directly to you. Your soulmate began remembering moments with you that seemed insignificant when they happened. A conversation you probably forgot. A reaction you gave without thinking. A moment when you did not demand an explanation from them. Perhaps you simply allowed silence to exist without filling it. To you, it may have been nothing extraordinary. To them, it became evidence of something rare. They felt understood without being interrogated. And that feeling frightened them, not because you were dangerous, but because it made comparison unavoidable. They began wondering why being emotionally honest with you sometimes felt easier than being honest inside the life they had spent years constructing. They did not immediately interpret that as romance. At first, they tried calling it comfort. Then friendship. Then timing. but every label seemed incomplete. The third party eventually learned about this connection too, and that was when their reaction changed completely. Their surprise about the marriage became secondary. Now they wanted to know why your name kept appearing around the moments when your soulmate seemed most reflective. Why did your soulmate remember tiny details about you? Why did their tone change whenever someone casually mentioned you? Why, despite everything already occupying their life, did they seem unable to treat your presence as something ordinary? The third party began wondering whether you knew any of this. Perhaps you did not. Perhaps from your side, the entire situation had felt confusing, warmth followed by distance, meaningful moments followed by silence. If you have ever wondered whether you imagined that emotional shift, the answer inside this story is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Something was changing, but your soulmate themselves had not yet decided what that change meant. And then the story took its quietest turn. Instead of rushing toward you, your soulmate stepped back. That might sound contradictory, but there was a reason. They understood that if their marriage required an honest conversation, that conversation needed to happen because of the marriage itself, not because another person was waiting outside it. They did not want you carrying responsibility for a decision that belonged to them. They did not want their spouse blamed for feelings nobody had intentionally created. And they did not want to approach you with half-finished promises while their existing life remained unresolved. So they created distance. Not because your presence meant nothing, but because it meant enough that they did not want to turn it into something careless. The third party had expected scandal. What they discovered instead was restraint. They had expected secret plans. What they found was someone repeatedly slowing themselves down. They had expected your soulmate to speak as though the answer were obvious. Instead, your soulmate kept saying, "I need to understand what is true before I ask anyone else to understand me." That changed how the third party viewed everything. For the first time, they stopped asking whether your soulmate was married and started asking a much deeper question: what had already happened inside that marriage before anyone else noticed? That answer was hidden inside a conversation from months earlier. Almost nobody knew about it. Your soulmate and their spouse had sat together one evening and acknowledged something they had both quietly sensed. Their relationship had changed. Neither wanted to humiliate the other. Neither wanted their history rewritten as meaningless. There was gratitude between them for what they had shared, but there was also a growing awareness that gratitude alone could not answer every question about the future. Instead of reaching an immediate conclusion, they agreed to give themselves time to understand what remained between them and what had simply become habit. That conversation was never announced. Family members continued seeing the same familiar picture. Friends assumed nothing had changed. The third party certainly knew nothing about it. And you may have been watching your soulmate from a distance without realizing that behind their silence, they were already confronting one of the most important decisions of their life. But there was one thing your soulmate did not reveal during that conversation. One name they kept to themselves. Not because they were planning something secret. Not because they had already chosen another future. They remained silent because saying that name would have complicated a conversation that needed to remain focused on the truth of the marriage itself. That name was yours. And when the third party eventually discovered that detail, they finally understood why the marriage was only the beginning of the story. Because your soulmate had been trying to answer a question that had nothing to do with chasing excitement and everything to do with integrity. If they became completely free to choose their next chapter, without guilt, pressure, expectation, or unfinished promises, what kind of life would they actually choose? They still did not have the full answer. But something happened after that private conversation, something involving their spouse, an unexpected question, and your name appearing at precisely the moment your soulmate thought they had successfully kept you outside the situation. And the response they gave is where the real truth begins to surface. The room became strangely still when your name was spoken, because your soulmate had prepared themselves for almost every difficult question except that one. Their spouse did not say your name with anger, accusation, or bitterness. That would almost have been easier to answer. Instead, the question arrived calmly: is there someone who made you realize something was missing between us? Your soulmate hesitated, and inside that hesitation was the truth they had been trying to understand for months. They could have denied everything. They could have hidden behind technical definitions and said nothing had happened. In one sense, that would even have been accurate. There had been no dramatic secret plan, no hidden promise about a future together, no certainty that you even understood how deeply your presence had affected them. Yet your soulmate knew the question was larger than whether something had happened. It was asking whether another human being had awakened an awareness they could no longer ignore. And eventually, quietly, your soulmate answered, "There is someone who made me think differently about myself." That sentence changed the conversation. Don't skip, because what their spouse said next was not what your soulmate, or the third party who later learned about it, expected at all. There was no explosion. Their spouse simply looked at them for a long moment and asked, "Did this person cause our distance, or did they make you finally notice it?" Your soulmate could barely answer immediately, because that was the question they had secretly been asking themselves. Finally they admitted, the distance was already here. And something softened between them. Not because everything suddenly became easy, but because both people were finally discussing reality instead of protecting appearances. Their spouse acknowledged that they had felt the same emotional change for a long time. They had noticed the polite conversations replacing vulnerable ones. They had noticed how decisions were increasingly made through routine rather than excitement. They had noticed that both of them were becoming careful around subjects that once would have been effortless. And perhaps the most surprising admission came when their spouse said they had also wondered whether continuing exactly as they were was fair to either of them. Your soulmate had spent months believing they were carrying this realization alone. Suddenly, they understood that silence had been happening on both sides. But your name still remained between them. Your soulmate had not said it yet. Their spouse did not demand it. Instead, they asked something far more revealing: "Does this person know?" Your soulmate shook their head. "Not really." Then came another question. "Have you promised them anything?" Again, the answer was no. "Have you asked them to wait for you?" "No, then don't," their spouse said gently. "Figure out us first." Those words stayed with your soulmate because they reflected exactly what they had been trying to do. Whatever connection existed between you and them deserved clarity, not confusion. Whatever happened inside their marriage deserved honesty, not comparison. And whatever future eventually emerged needed to come from mature decisions rather than emotional urgency. That was when your soulmate made a private choice. They would not pull you deeper into an unfinished situation. They would understand their present before speaking about a possible future. Far away from that conversation, however, the third party was piecing together a completely different version. They had discovered the marriage, then heard whispers that your soulmate had become emotionally reflective because of someone else. Naturally, they assumed there must be a dramatic secret behind it. But each new fact contradicted that assumption. Your soulmate was not secretly making promises to you. They were not rushing toward a new relationship. They were actually creating boundaries. And the more the third party learned, the more puzzled they became. Why would someone who supposedly wanted another person deliberately keep their distance? Why would they refuse to speak badly about their spouse? Why would they insist on resolving one chapter before touching another? The answer was simple but powerful. Your soulmate did not want a future built from somebody else's humiliation. They wanted, if change eventually came, to leave everyone with dignity. Then the third party heard one detail that shifted everything again. Your soulmate had been offered an easy opportunity to contact you. Someone close to them casually suggested, "Why don't you just tell them how you feel?" Your soulmate's response came instantly, "Because I don't know what I can honestly offer them yet." That sentence revealed more than a confession ever could. Feelings were not the issue anymore. Responsibility was. Your soulmate understood that saying beautiful words would be easy. Living responsibly after those words would be harder. So they chose the harder silence. And perhaps that explains something you may have misunderstood. If you ever felt as though this person moved emotionally closer and then suddenly disappeared behind distance, you might have interpreted that as indifference. Inside this story, the opposite was happening. The closer their feelings came to becoming undeniable, the more seriously they considered the consequences of expressing them. Then came a moment nobody planned. Your soulmate spouse saw your name. Not through anything secretive or inappropriate. Your name appeared naturally during an ordinary exchange involving mutual connections and everyday conversation. But the reaction on your soulmate's face was just noticeable enough. A fraction of a second. A pause almost too small to measure. Yet when someone has shared years of life with another person, tiny changes can speak loudly. Their spouse noticed. Later that evening, they asked, "Was that the person?" Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And this time, they decided not to hide. Yes. One word. No dramatic explanation followed. Their spouse looked away for a moment, then asked, "What is it about them?" Your soulmate could have answered with attraction. They could have described your appearance or listed qualities they admired. Instead, they said something that surprised even themselves. "I feel like I don't have to become someone else around them." That was the real revelation. Your presence had not simply attracted your soulmate. It had reminded them of a version of themselves they had gradually stopped expressing. A lighter version. A more curious version. Someone who could speak without rehearsing every sentence. Someone who could imagine possibilities without immediately measuring them against everyone else's expectations. That did not automatically mean you were destined to become their next relationship. Your soulmate understood that. But it did mean the connection had shown them something valuable about themselves, and once they saw it, they could not pretend they had never seen it. Stay till the end, because the third party's next discovery changed their attitude toward you completely. Until then, they had quietly viewed you as an outsider entering an established story. But when they learned that the marriage had already been undergoing honest conversations long before your role became known, their judgment weakened. They began wondering whether you might not even know the full situation. Then someone confirmed it: you had not been given the complete story. You had not been invited into the private discussions. You had not been promised an outcome. Suddenly, the third party realized something uncomfortable about their own assumptions. They had been assigning motives to you without knowing what you had actually been told. That realization led them to ask a question they had avoided: what does this person actually want? Nobody could answer. And strangely, that became important. Because everyone had been discussing your soulmate's marriage, your soulmate's feelings, your soulmate's choices. But almost nobody had considered your freedom to choose what you wanted once the truth became clear. Your soulmate had considered it. That was one reason they had resisted approaching you prematurely. They did not want to appear one day carrying a complicated story and expect you to immediately step inside it. They understood that you might need time. You might have questions. You might decide the connection was meaningful but the circumstances were too complicated. You might choose a completely different direction. And your soulmate knew that respecting you meant accepting all of those possibilities. Something important is waiting for you, because this is where the story stops being simply about a hidden marriage and becomes about truth itself. Your soulmate finally understood that genuine care cannot be measured only by how strongly someone wants you. Sometimes it is measured by whether they respect your right to say yes, no, not yet, or I need to understand more. So they made another decision. When the time came to speak with you, they would not arrive with a grand declaration designed to overwhelm you. They would arrive with facts. They would tell you what the marriage had been, what had changed, what remained unresolved, and what they had learned about themselves. Then they would allow you to respond without pressure. But that conversation still could not happen yet. Because the marriage had reached one final crossroads. Your soulmate and their spouse had agreed that continuing in uncertainty indefinitely would eventually become its own kind of decision. They needed to determine whether they genuinely wanted to rebuild their relationship or respectfully acknowledge that their shared chapter had changed. So they chose a period of complete honesty. No pretending for family. No making decisions based solely on what others expected. No bringing you, or anyone else, into the decision. Just two people examining whether the foundation between them still contained something both truly wanted to restore. For several days, your soulmate became quieter than usual. The third party noticed. You may have noticed too. Then one evening, your soulmate's spouse asked them a question so simple that it removed every excuse: if nobody would judge either of us, what would you choose? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. Because for the first time, the question contained no family expectations, no social image, no fear of disappointing anyone, and no imaginary future with you being used as an escape. Only truth. Minutes passed. Then your soulmate finally spoke. But before they could finish, their spouse interrupted with words that changed the direction of the entire conversation. I think I already know your answer, because mine is the same. And what they agreed to do next was the detail the third party never expected to discover.